What's up everyone, welcome to this new video. In this video I'm going to talk about the fried liver opening. Many of you might know the fried liver as a great opening for beginners, but even at the more advanced levels there are still some very cool lines that can win you the game very quickly. I myself am around 1700 rated rapid on chess.com and I still use the fried liver as my main opening. Before we dive into the more complicated lines, I will first discuss the basic opening ideas which make the opening so effective at a beginner level. To go into a fried liver opening, you first of all have to go into an Italian opening. This occurs after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. And now black has a couple of moves, but the main move we're going to look at is knight to f6. This allows the fried liver with knight to g5. Now this simply attacks the pawn on f7, and the only defender for black is the king, which isn't great. Now black mainly has two moves to defend against this threat. The first one is quite counterintuitive. It's bishop c5. Now this allows the fork from the queen and the rook. But black will counter-strike with bishop takes f2, which is very complicated. It's called a Traxler. And if you're going to play this, you have to be very well prepared with either black and white, by the way. Now, I'm not going to dive too deep into this. I'm mainly going to look at the other move black can play, which is d5. After d5, white basically is forced to take the pawn with its own pawn. And here black has a couple of moves. And one of them, a very natural move, is actually a big mistake. Here, if black takes the pawn with its knight, white can still take on f7, which is super interesting. You still fork the rook and the queen, but now of course the king can take the knight. But here, white can actually fork the king and the knight. And the only way to preserve material here is to play king e6, which just visually looks very, very dangerous. Because the king is in the center and the knight is also pinned by the bishop. And the plan here for white is basically to put as much pressure on the knight. By, for example, playing knight c3. And here you have to be a little bit careful because after knight to b4, black is actually threatening a fork of its own. So here white has to play king d1. And here it gets very complicated. White wants to play moves like rook e1 and even put pressure on this pawn. And this is very dangerous for black and almost winning for white actually. The second move black can play after e takes d5, which we're going to pay the most attention to in this video, and can also lead to some very interesting lines which can even be played at advanced levels, is the move knight to a5. Now this move attacks the bishop. Now in this position there basically is kind of a forced line for both white and black. Now the move for white here is bishop b5 check. Now basically the only move here is to block with the pawn, and after this white can take, black can take back, attacking the bishop, and it looks like after this move the initiative for white is pretty much gone. Because the bishop is attacked and it basically has to move. But here there's a very interesting move which I play myself and it works like magic most of the time, and it's queen f3. Queen f3 is one of the more interesting moves I've played and I've seen. Now the point of queen f3 is quite simple, which is that it pins the pawn to the rook. This means that black can't really take the bishop, although this is still a viable option, simply because white's pieces are so underdeveloped and black is very quick development. Now I would still say that this is pretty decent for white, because if white is able to consolidate, white should be much better with the exchange in the extra pawn, but it's still kind of tricky. Now the second move I will show is the top engine move, which I've never seen played before because it's quite weird. It is rook to b8. Now here white can simply take the pawn, and after knight takes, queen can take. And the point is kind of that although white is up 2 pawns, black has the initiative, better development, also quicker development, and this kind of compensates for the 2 lost pawns. But I would still say that if white's able to consolidate, white will be much better. And again, rook b8 is such like a computer move that's very rarely played. Now black doesn't have to go into some kind of exchange sacrifice or doesn't even have to lose the pawn. black can simply play the move bishop b7, for example, and now white has to move the bishop. But what's interesting is that after this move, white still has the advantage according to Stockfish, and quite a significant one. Stockfish gives around +1 for white here. The reason for that is mainly because the pawn is quite weak, the knight is kind of weirdly placed, black also has to do some development, and of course white is simply up a pawn. Now this compensates kind of the lack of development for white as well. And what's interesting to note here is that white also has some easy development moves. Black cannot really punish the lack of development, and white can make simply moves like castles, knight to c3, maybe even d3 and develop the bishop to, let's say, e3. Now it needs to be said that the move queen f3 doesn't win the game on the spot, but to me it's such an interesting move, and we haven't even discussed all the dynamics that occur after, for example, bishop b7. I mean, we haven't talked about the pin that's here, this pin is still here, and there's also still a lot of pressure on f7 actually. So at least in this opening you're getting an interesting position with a lot of possibilities basically for black to make mistakes. They often don't know what they're doing, they're often out of theory, which can be a huge advantage for white here. Now I hope you guys enjoyed this video about the Fried Liver opening. You might want to play it yourselves now. I really enjoyed this opening, but thanks for watching anyways, and leave a like if you liked the video. Feel free to subscribe, and see you next time.